students. You're welcome to Chapter 7 of this class, Information Privacy and Privacy by Design. Okay, today our topic for today, Chapter 7, our topic is Privacy in Databases. We want to quickly look at privacy in a database. Okay, without much ado, let's begin as usual. First and foremost, let's take a look at database privacy quickly. Okay, the government standard in the United States, they come up with a lot of publications that enhances how data informations in a database can be protected or can be secreted from attack and vulnerability. So some of the techniques that they've used to create guidelines for creating guidelines for information in databases are as follows. First of all, we have what we call the ISO 20889, which has a document that they published, and this document is titled Privacy Enhancing Data De-Identification Terminology and Classification of Techniques. So this document was published in 2018, and then this document provides good overview of basic concept related to anything that has to do with de-identification attack, any de-identification attack, or anything related to re-identification. Re-identification is an attack on a de-identification. So when we de-identify personally identifiable information, when the attacker want to attack your de-identified information, they will re-identify the information. Okay, in this chapter we're going to explain once again re-identification. It's an attack on a de-identification, because de-identification is like a data encryption or protection that removes your personally identifiable information that from a set of your values. For example, if you collect data on your health status, in the hospital they collected data, they make data available, they create data about you regarding your health status. For example, if you have arthritis, your name, your address, your zip code, they are part of all the informations that constitute your data, and then your sickness, the hospital, and whatever. So they create this in a database, right? So but if they want to publish these documents about health status of people, they would carry out what we call de-identification. The hospital will carry out what we call de-identification. They will remove your name, your zip code, and your address. These things in the United States, they have to take out these things so that it will create kind of de-identification. So people cannot identify these individuals who owns this personally identifiable information. So, but what attackers do, they kind of find a way. They find a way to carry out re-identification attack on these informations and be able to trace the particular peoples whose these documents or this data belongs to. So this is invasion of privacy, and it's punishable by law. It's punishable by law. So the attack on the identification is called re-identification. Now, another publication that has something to do with database privacy is the NIST SP 800-188. Now, what this document is, the title of this document is the Identifying Government Data Sets. Now, this document provides specific guidance on the use of the identification techniques. So, this document is giving guidance on how to use the identification techniques. Okay, the different way to carry out the identification methodology. So this one helps to encrypt the data by removing the different techniques for removing the personally identifiable information, the owners, or what you call the subject in this regard, the subject or the principal subject, or ability to remove the names, the address, and the zip code from this set of data. Create what we call the identification. There are two ways of creating privacy in this regard. One is the identification methodology. Another one is anonymization. anonymization. You can use anonymization method also to remove the sensitive information, sensitive personally identifiable information from this set of data. Okay, so another publication that has to do with database privacy is the NIST 8053, which is a document titled The Identification of Personal Information. This document is titled The Identification of Personal Information. Now, this document provides a survey of the identification techniques. So it's like a research carried out to find out the different techniques that is being used to carry out the identification system pattern. Okay, another publication is WP216, and it's titled Opinion, and it was published in May 2014 on Anonymization Techniques. Okay, this document is from European Union, and it talks about data protection working party, and it talks more on the robustness of the various anonymizations and the identification techniques. So it's basically and practically talking about the different methodologies that is used for anonymization and the identification techniques. These things are simply like, in other words, simply encrypting a message so that people cannot find who this message belongs to. Though you can see the message database, you can still see the database and the content of the database, but you will not know who this personally identifiable information comes from, because they collect this data. Government collects this data for research purposes, hospital collects this data for research purposes, and to see know how the different sickness, how the sickness is spreading, how this is just like when we had coronavirus the last couple of 2 years ago. Facebook had their own system of collecting the data from about coronavirus. There's so many platforms were collecting data on about coronavirus. Every country had their agencies that were responsible for disease and control, and these agencies that are responsible for disease and control were collecting data regarding coronavirus. And so, but if we want to publish this kind of data, we have to carry out the identification of personally identifiable information in order to protect the integrity or the people whose this information belongs to in the first instance. Okay, another publication is the SPW22, which is a statistical policy working paper 22, report on statistical disclosure limitation methodology. So this is a document, and this document is from the U.S. Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, and it provides an overview of current practices in the anonymization and the identification. It's just showing the correct practice that is already in existence for anonymization and the identification. Now let's take a look at the identification and anonymization. These two techniques for hiding the identities or owners or principal subject of the personally identifiable information. Now, let's take a look at them. Now, these two terminology, the identification and anonymization, they are commonly used in describing obfuscation of personally identifiable information privacy purposes. Now, what is obfuscation? Obfuscation is simply like making a message or making an information unintelligible. Making an information unintelligible. You make it in a way that people cannot understand what is there, okay, or will not know who this message belongs to. Even if the message they can see, they cannot link it to the subject, the principal subject. That's the owner of the message, because his name has been removed, his address has been removed, his zip code has been removed, his social security number has been removed. So this type of methodology of obfuscation creates de-identification or anonymization technique. You can only be able to obfuscate a message or information by way of carrying out what we call the identification or anonymization techniques. Okay, these two covers this broad sense. We say the identification and anonymization. It's when, for example, if we want to broadly explain this, is when an organization that collects personally identifiable information on a group of individuals and stores it as a set of files for their record, right? Then if one per individual, often refers to as the data set, one of this record per individual. and all of them collectively are called the data set. Then if the organization wants to use this data set for application or applications that do not require individual identification, they want to use them, but they don't have to show the owners of this information and their health status. Then the objective is to retain useful data while concealing information that identifies the individuals as the rightful owner of this information, meaning you have to find a way to hide this individual's name, their addresses, their zip code, probably their social security number, so that the public will not know who are these male or female that have HIV, that have arthritis, that have hepatitis, that have cancer, that have chronic cancers. So when we carry out research and the hospital carries out all this research, collate this data, when they want to publish them, they have to carry out what we call the identification or anonymization, by a way of removing the sensitive personally identifiable information, such as the name of the individuals, such as the address of this individual, such as their social security number. So removing the social security number, removing their zip code, because if you don't do this, then people can say, oh, so person has this sickness, sickness and sensitive personally identifiable informations. Certain sicknesses are very sensitive personally identifiable information. That's sensitive PII. So if you want to publish them for the sake of the public being aware of the health status of that environment, but you have to carry out what we call the identification or anonymization. That means you have to hide the ownership of these information that you are publishing. Is that okay? So you have to conceal the information that identifies the individual as the rightful owners, by reducing the extent to which the identified information is able to be associated to the individual that owns those information in the first instance. Now let's take a look at the identification. What is the identification? The identification of personally identifiable information has some of these characteristics. Okay, some characteristics for each individual in a group. Now, first and foremost, one of the characteristics that the identification has is that the remaining data do not suffice to identify the data to the personally identifiable principal to whom they relate. So after you've removed some, like you remove the person's name, you've removed the person's address, you've removed the person's zip code, you remove the person's social security number. So what is remaining probably is not enough for the public to be able to identify the owners of this information. So in other words, technically you are de-identifying the information. Okay? So that's one characteristic of the identification. Another characteristic is that a re-identification parameter is associated with the de-identified data such that the combination of the parameter and the de-identified data enables the identification of the associated principal, PII principal. What this intends or this explains is that a re-identification parameter is dangerous because that's what the attackers use. Attackers, they introduce a re-identification parameter, and when this combined with the identified data set, it's able to reorganize and find the owners of this information. So a re-identification parameter is not good to be introduced with a de-identified data set. When that happens, it's able, the combination of the re-identified parameter or re-identification parameter with the de-identified data set is able to bring the rightful owners, identify the owners, the principals upon which this information belongs in the first place. So this is one way the attackers find a way to hack and be able to find the rightful owner of these informations, because they introduce what we call a re-identification parameter into the de-identified data set. And the combination of both is able to bring out the identification of the rightful principal owners of this personally identifiable information. Now let's go on quickly. An adversary not in possession of the re-identification parameter cannot recover personal identity from. So any adversary, anyone who wants to attack your data, okay, if he doesn't have a re-identification parameter, he cannot be able to recover the rightful owners of this information. So a re-identification parameter is key for breaking the de-identified information and getting the right identification of the information. So a re-identification parameter must be kept very private and very secret in order when anyone, whether from the internal, from the organization, get a hold of it, or from the external, they will be able to break the information and be able to find whose this information belongs to in the first place. Okay, the identification retains the potential of recovery the identity associated with the identified data. Okay, they have a potential. So potential of recovery the identity of the people who owns the information in the first place. So that's why we don't need to combine it with the identification parameter. Okay, let's move on quickly. Now, what is anonymization? Anonymization of personally identifiable information has these characteristics, this characteristics of individual in a group. First, the remaining data sets do not suffice to associate identified data to the personally identifiable information principals to whom they relate. Because whatever, if you've taken out the name when you are de-identifying, you take out the address, you take out the social security number, you take out the zip code, whatever is remaining, maybe like the age or the sex, is a male, is he a male, is he a female, is he the age, is the health status. These ones are not enough to be able to find out who this information belongs to. Okay, another characteristic of anonymization is that the adversary cannot recover personal identities from the anonymized data by the reasonable effort. So they cannot. Okay, they cannot, because you've taken out a significant part of the information. Now let's take a look at figure 7.1. Figure 7.1 is a data collection. Data collection, the identification and use. First of all, they collect data. You know, when you collect data, whether you are a hospital or you are a Walmart, like you are a big shopping mall in US, Walmart is one of the biggest shopping mall in US, or you are Costco. Costco is in US and Canada. You are Costco. You know, these organizations, they collect data somehow. So every organization, especially hospitals, they collect data. Research centers, they collect data. Immigration office, they collect data. So first of all, you collect data. The next thing is to carry out the identification, especially data that you are collecting for the purpose of reuse, publication, for research purpose. You have to carry out what we call the identification, and then before you can use. If you don't do this, then you are revealing the owners of this data, especially if they are sensitive, personally identifiable data. Now, first and foremost, we collect data. Let's say Alice. We collect data from Alice. This is a person. We collect data from Bob. This is a person. We collect data from Cynthia. Collect data for Daniel. So then it become what? Data set with personal identifiable. All of them put together, you create a database. The database is a data set. Okay? So when you collect data of different people, this data may be their name, their address, their zip code, their social security number, their health status, their sex, their gender, whether they are male or female, their height, their weight, their health status, whether it has arthritis or cancer or diabetes. So all of this, so if all these data are created in a database, right? In a database in your network. Now, after collecting all this data, even their photos, you get their photos, their passport photos, their passport number, and so on and so on, or their national identity number, driving license, and so on and so forth. So after collecting all this data from all of this, they're created in a database, okay, in an organization. So the next thing you do is to carry out the identification, meaning you hide their names. The meaning of the identification is to hide the owners of this data. That's the meaning of the identification, to hide the owners of this data by removing their names, by removing their address, home addresses, by removing their zip code, by removing their social security number, anything that will make people to be able to trace the owners of this data. Once you carry that out, you have carried out you have identified the data. Because at first they were all protected data. Then when you now carry out the identification, it becomes a data set thought to have no PII. Now, after you carry out the identification, they are now protected. Now, for use, data use agreement must be the person in the web must click on agree to terms and conditions before they can use. So when they do that, it's trusted data recipient. So you approve. See, you approve. The person can now use. Okay, let's put this one where it's supposed to be. Okay, the person approved. Then the person can have access to the data because you've done a set of work on the data. Okay, then Then we say publish or vetted data recipient. There's a big question mark because this is vetted. You did vet it, whether the recipient is a trusted partner or he has a data use agreement. There must be a data use agreement. Okay, so there's a question mark here. So this figure is showing data collection, identification, and data usage. Okay, let's go quickly. We have a lot to do. Right? Personal data attribute. Let's take a look at data attributes. There are about 4 different attributes that are used with data that are related to individual. Personal data consists of attributes related to individuals, right? With respect to privacy, attributes can be classified into 4 categories. The first one is called the direct identifier. The second one is called the quasi identifier. The third one is called confidential attribute, and the fourth one is called non-confidential attribute. Now let's take a look at direct identifier. The direct identifier, it's a kind of identifier that has a variable that provides an explicit link to data subject, something that has a link to the data subject. You remember the data subject is the principal PII. So something that has a link with the data subject and can directly identify an individual, like a re-identification parameter, okay? Like a re-identification parameter. If any variable that has a exclusive or explicit link to the data set and can directly identify the owners of these informations are called direct identifier. Then what is quasi identifier? A quasi identifier by itself does not identify a specific individual. The quasi itself does not identify any specific individual, okay? But what quasi does, it can be aggregated and linked with other information to identify data subjects. It can be aggregated and be linked with other information to get the owners of these data, the owners of the principals, the subject principals. Okay? Now, what they told, what the quasi itself cannot identify people, but it can be linked with other information to be able to identify the subjects. Now, confidential attributes. Confidential attributes not in the personally identifiable information or QI categories may contain sensitive data subject information. So confidential is something that contains what? Very sensitive data subject information. Then non-confidential attributes, some attributes data subjects, they do not typically consider sensitive, because some things, information you have, they are not sensitive. Okay, now let's move on to the next one. Okay, the next one is types of data files. Types of data files. We have about 3 different data files when we are looking at the identification and anonymization. The identification and anonymization, they are applicable to data sets that are found in our databases, right? And they are released in some context to enable analysis by third party for which privacy concern must be addressed. Now, some of these data sets are one, microdata table in a database. We have a microdata table. Now, a microdata table consists of individual records, your record making your name, your address, your zip code, okay? Your individual record, each containing values of attribute for a single individual or other entities. So it's the microdata table is just about your individual records, like your name, your address, and your zip code. Then we have the number 2 type of data file is a data summary table in a database. The summary table. Summary table is also called macro data table. Just like we have micro data table as the first one, the second one is macro data table. That macro data table is also called summary table. Macro data table, it's typically 2-dimensional table that has rows and columns. Normal table in a database that has rows and also have columns representing 2 different attributes. Okay, attributes on the columns and the attributes on the rows are different. They are different. They represent 2 categorical different attributes. That's why they have rows and columns. So these are called the macro data table, okay, or what you call the summary table. They contain aggregated data about individuals derived from the micro. They contain different micro data put together to form the macro data. Okay. Now we have order this macro data table, or what you call the summary table. It consists of two types. There are actually two types of we have the one we call the frequency table, and we have the other one we call the magnitude table. The frequency table presents the number of units of analysis in a table cells. Number of units. Okay, the number of units of analysis in a table cell. The magnitude table display information on numerical aggregate value in a table. Okay, it just shows the numerical aggregate value in a table cells. Okay, the analysis is frequency table. Then numerical aggregate value is magnitude. Okay, now the third type of data file in the database is the queryable table database. What we call the queryable database. In the queryable database, many organizations provide online query access to summary table. So many summary table will form this queryable database. Then data users create their own tabulations with customized queries. The users can create their tabulations with customized queries in the queryable database. Then a query system that interfaces to an unprotected microdata file must automatically apply disclosure. So this one is kind of protected somehow, because we say a query system here that interfaces with unprotected microdata file must automatically apply disclosure, okay, before it can be accessed. Now here is a figure 7.2, which is releasable data set. Now this is an individual trying to access, or a respondent trying to access a database. So you see here unprotected microdata files. Okay, these data files are unprotected. So what the system algorithm does is to anonymize or de-identify. Either you carry out anonymize so that it can be protected, because the information here, the information is unprotected, meaning if you publish this information, everyone will see, let's say for the case of hospital, everyone will see this individual, their name, their address, their social security number, their zip code, their health status, whether they have diabetes, or they have cancer, or they have whatever they have, will be very visible. Will be very visible to everyone. So that's why you have to carry out anonymization and de-identification. Once that is done, the macro data file becomes protected. It becomes protected. Okay, then you can publish. See, at this point you can publish. First, you collect data, and this become your database. Okay, this database, you must carry out what we call anonymization or de-identification. Once that is carried out, the macro data file becomes protected. Okay, remember this is the first. There are three types of database. We mention micro database. We mention macro, number 2, which is also called summary table. Macro table, which is summary table. Then we measure the third one, which is a queryable database. The third one. Okay. Now the second one, which is called the macro, you know, it's of two types. The macro, or what you call summary table, is of two types: frequency summary table and magnitude summary table. Okay. So there's an aggregation here, meaning multiple of this one, many individual, very many individual, complex table result to this one. So there's an aggregation. PP means privacy preserving. So meaning whenever you see PP aggregation, first there's aggregation here, then there's PP aggregation, meaning you preserve the privacy of these individuals. Both in these two tables, frequency and magnitude, put together, all of them publish, because you have carried out the identification. So these data sets are protected. Now let's move on quickly. So this is showing it in the structure of the macro data set and summary table. Okay, macro data set and summary table. This is summary table. You know, summary table, we say they have rows and columns. Rows and columns. Summary table, or what you call macro. They contain rows and columns. This one you see is only rows. There's no column. There's no column. Only rows, rows, rows. So this is just like you will give you your information, the name and blah blah blah, your age, your this, your that. Same person, just giving all your information. But here is for many people. You can use this one database to create for many people. So if you write this person Alice here, you talk about Alice. First of all, maybe name. You write Alice. That is number one person. So you write his name here, his name, his age, or his health status, or his social security number, zip code, address, everything. So you go to another person, maybe Bob. So this is for summary table. This first one is for macro data table in a database. Okay, now let's move on quickly. So you can see table 7.1, an example of frequency count and percentage and magnitude summary. So this is a summary table, both the magnitude and the frequency one. Take a look at it because it has rows, it has columns. These are the column. This is a 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 column. You can see the rows: male, another row female, then total. You can see. So this is a macro or summary table in a database. So you have the male. You see arthritis. You see arthritis there. Pneumonia 18 for male. Diabetes 19 for male. Heart disease 12 for male, and total is 59. Female arthritis is 19. That means female in this case have more arthritis. Pneumonia is 17, close to that of male. But diabetes, less female have diabetes, only one. Then because men we like sugary food more, right? According to this report, I'm just describing this report. Okay, the heart disease, male also have heart disease more than female. So you can see 6 for female. So you have the total for each one. Total arthritis 29, total for pneumonia is 35, so you can see this is a summary table because it has rows and columns. This is a summary table, macro database. Okay, then the B is percentage of individual with the disease. You can see this data. They are de-identified and they are anonymized. The name of the owners are not here. The names of the owners are not here. Their address are not here. Their zip code are not here. Their social security number are not here. So this data can be used for research purposes. Because we have de-identified the data. We've removed the names, the address, zip codes, and even the social security number. Okay. Then we go to the B. These are showing in terms of percentage, not in terms of number. Percentage of people who have arthritis, male is 9.8%, pneumonia 17.6%, diabetes 18.6%, heart disease 11.8%. So in terms of percentage, the same information here, but we just calculate the percentage. How do you do percentage? 10 over 29 times 100, you get this percentage, right? As in, okay. So then we look at this one, average number of days spent in the hospital. So number of days spent in hospital for male, female, and so on and so forth. So you can see this is a database looking at different concepts of summary database looking at different concepts. Now let's go to re-identification attack, because this is what the attackers do. They introduce what we call the identification parameter to a de-identified data set, and then they will be able to know who owns this information. Now, the document concerning re-identification of consumer information from the Electronic Privacy Information Center sets up a document and a number of examples of re-identification of the identifier or anonymized data. And they include one. One is Netflix studies. Netflix released 100 million records regarding how its user had related movies over 6 years period. Then they, even though identified user names were removed, all their names and all their address, all their zip code were removed, and each user was given a unique identifying number. Researchers found that it was relatively easy to re-identify the individuals. Despite Netflix removed the names of these people and their address and whatever, researchers have been able to find out that it was easy to re-identify those people who owns this information in the first instance. Okay. Then another one is the America Online release of user data. In 2006, America Online publicly published over 20 million search queries for 650,000 America Online search engine users. Okay, before the data were released, the America Online anonymized it by removing the what we identify the owners of this PII, this personally identifiable information. They remove what will make people to know the owners of this information. Even though they did this, research shows that after a short time, journalists found out that many people were still able to find out the owners of this information. What you just need to do is to take a re-identification, find the re-identification parameter and add it to the de-identified data data. You'll be able to find the owners of this information. So unique identification through zip code, sex, and birthday. So that's why don't always release your birthday everywhere, anywhere. People can use it to trace and be able to note who owns this information. According to studies of census data by Nathaniel Swissley, 87% of the American population has a unique combination of zip code. They have unique combination of birth date. They have also for sex. Now, what this means is that combination of these three pieces of information is enough to identify anybody that owns this information. So if they get hold of this, and these are called re-identification parameters, if they're able to get hold of this, then they will be able to find who owns this information in the first instance. Now, re-identify health data. Then, Sweetly also illustrated the threat of re-identification of health data by gathering PII on William Weld, the governor of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of my best states in the United States. This where you have city of Boston, and this where you have MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the best universities in the world. Okay, this where you have Harvard University. So it's an elite environment. Okay, so they found out that if you have access to people's zip code, their sex, you know whether the person is a male or female, their birth date, you'll be able to, even if these data were encrypted or kind of de-identified, you will be able to find the owners of this information. Now, what they do is that they combine the data from two databases. One was set of hospital data on state employees released to researchers by the Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission for the purpose of improving the healthcare and controlling the cost of healthcare. So, always government, they have good intentions sometimes, or most times, for the reasons of release of data or government agency, usually for research purposes. But however, sometimes this may go out of hand if these data are released. The hospital data provider remove the names and the address and social security numbers and other identifying information in order to protect the privacy of these employees. Okay, the hospital employees. So in order to protect their privacies, they remove this. They remove their names, their addresses, their social security number, and any other one like the zip code that may be used to trace the owners of this data. Now, the other data set was publicly available. Every other information like your illness, your whatever that they need to, your sex, like your gender, your male, female, and so on and so forth. Every other things were made publicly available. Okay? Voter registration rolls, which included the names, address, zip code, birthday, and sex of every voter. Now, from two data, one was you withdraw the very sensitive PII, and then the other one, the voter one, you had the name, the address, and zip code. Now from GIC's databases, only 6 people in Cambridge were born on the same day as the governor. Half of them were men, and the governor was the only one who lived in the zip code provided in the voters' roll. So you see, it's easy for these people to be able to trace when they have all this information, like your date of birth, your sex, your zip code, your name, your address, and so on and so forth. So once they have this, they will easily be able to identify the original owners of this data in the first place. Now let's take a look at figure 7.4, which is a type of attacks on the identifier and anonymized data. First of all, you see let's say these are the people that you're collecting the information from. All this, let's say they are the people. They are your PII, personally identifiable information. So you got this information from these individuals. Now after this, in your database, you have to carry out what we call the identification. Okay, once you carry out the identification, you now have the identified data. So meaning protected data. This data is not complete. You've removed the names, address, the names, the addresses, the zip code, the social security number of these people, right? Okay, this is what we do normally. Now, but attackers, this is what they do. They will attack the identified data with a privacy attack, and then they will identify. Remember, we also have in between this personal identifiable information, you have what we call re-identification parameter. We always have it in our system, re-identification parameter, because for tomorrow, if we want to use it in the same data in our organization, not for the purpose of publications, we can introduce this re-identification so that we can get back our original information. Because the moment you put re-identification parameter, you'll be able to get these original informations. Okay, complete set of data with the names, addresses, social security number. So attacker, what they do, they attack the identified data with a privacy attack, and they want to steal this re-identification parameter. They want to steal it. So they attack it with security attack. So they want to steal it, because the moment they get hold of this one, then they will apply it here. They will apply it here, and then they will get everything here. They will get it. That's what the attacker do. So this first one is for the identification. Then this second one is for anonymization. These are the set of people you collect your personally identifiable information from, and then you carry out anonymization, and then you have an anonymized set of data. So the attacker in anonymization, you don't need the re-identification parameter. You see, you don't need the re-identification parameter. So the attacker is only going to attack your anonymized data. But it's always very difficult to succeed here. It's easy to succeed here because once he is able to attack the re-identification parameter and apply it on the identification, he will be able to get the original data. Okay, so this figure is explaining anonymization and the identification techniques. So table 7.2 is showing the threat to personal information. For example, type of information, personally identifiable information. Authorized user has control access, so they can access. Adversary, those who want to attack you, want to steal. And then they attack, there will be a security breach and there will be a privacy breach. Because they attack your security system, they attack your privacy. So defeat system access control. Once they're able to do that, they will be able to access it. Defeat privacy control. Once they will see everything. So there are another type of information is the identified personal information. Like this one, the identified personal information, this one. You have the identified it, this one. The identified set of data, this one. Okay, it's a protected data. That means your name, your address is no more there. They've removed it, okay? The organization has removed it before they made it available for research purposes. They removed your zip code, your name, your addresses. Okay, this data is the identified type of data. So for authorized user, they have to re-identify using identification parameter. Authorized user, every time they want to use this, they have to introduce what we call re-identification parameter in order to get the original data. Okay. Therefore, adversary, your attackers, those who want to steal from your network, it's only when they're able to defeat and access control, then they will be able to still your re-identification parameter. And then the same thing, re-identify without identification parameter, possibly using multiple data sources. Now, for anonymized data is also a set of type of data. So we have PII, we have the identify personal data, we have anonymized data. Now, this one cannot carry out re-identification, and then the adversary is difficult to attack your security because you don't have a re-identification parameter. So there is no security breach, but they can only try on your privacy breach. Okay, they can only try on your privacy. Now, potential attackers. Now let's talk about the attackers. Now, in assessing the risk of a re-identification attack, organization needs to consider motivations of individuals who might attempt re-identification on your the identified data set. So what is their motivation? So NIST IR 8053 identified this following category, these three categories. Why do people do this? Why do people want to do this? Despite it's a tedious thing to do, still why do people want to do this? One, to attack your data and be able to get the full names of the people who owns this personally identifiable information. One is to test the quality of the identification. So people just do it for fun to see whether your system is super protected. Another thing is to embarrass or harm the organization that perform the identification. To embarrass you and tell you, oh, despite you carry out the identified set of data, on your personally identifiable information, we can still break it and release the names of the owners of this information. So they've embarrassed you, or even steal the information if it's very important. Another, the third one is to gain direct benefit from the identified data, like steal it, gain direct benefit, maybe for marketing uses, for investment uses, for whatever. Okay. Now, disclosure risk. First of all, a disclosure relates to inappropriate attribution of information to a data set or to a data subject, whether an individual as a data subject or as an organization as a data subject. So the inappropriate attribution of information, that's disclosure. But something that is not appropriate, you attribute information to place or individual or organization that you're not supposed to. Now, the types of disclosure include: one, there are three main types of disclosure. One is identity disclosure, two is attribute disclosure, and the third one is inferential disclosure. Identity disclosure, this type of disclosure occurs when a record in anonymized the identified data set can be linked with individual identity. When they are able to break into it and link this anonymized data set or your de-identified data set and link it with the rightful owners of this information. Okay, this is called identity disclosure. How do the people carry out this identity disclosure? What they do is that they match one or more records from the data set of records of the individual to a specific individual. They try to match the record to the individual, match till they find a match. Okay. The second type of disclosure is called the attribute disclosure. This type of disclosure occurs when sensitive information about a data subject is revealed through identified files. Very sensitive information is revealed. That's called attribute disclosure. The third one is inferential disclosure. When the type of disclosure, when they release data, make it possible to determine the value of some characteristics of the individual, or more accurately than should have otherwise be. Okay. Now let's quickly take a look at more on table 7.4. Okay, 7.3 is just showing the applicability of the identified and anonymized concealment to privacy risk. So here they will talk about information dissemination, information processing, information collection. What you do, you use surveillance to collect information, and you do interrogation to collect information. Under information processing, you do aggregation, you do the identification, security, and so on and so forth, secondary use, exclusion, and then other information dissemination, you use breach of confidentiality, disclosure, exposure, decrease, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's go to 7.4 examples of direct identifiers and quasi identifier. For direct identifier, in like your name and your address and your birthday, these are your name and your address. The third one is that could be under here is your zip code for direct identifier. Things that can easily identify who you are: your name, of course, your address, of course, your zip code, of course. These three things are quickest direct identifier. Quasi identifier, they do not identify you directly, but when they are matched with other information, then they will be able to identify you. A good example of information that belongs to quasi identifiers or quasi identification is your birthday. Okay, so be careful how you share your birthday with everyone. Your postal code, your sex. Okay, this one, whether you're male or female, these ones, they belongs to the quasi identification or quasi identifier. There are other attributes that may be used to identify anybody is your weight, your diagnosis, your diseases, and so on and so forth. Now let's move on. This is original database. You can see the original database. You see Chris Adams, age 47, is a male, weight is 210, he has a heart disease. Okay, you can see John Blay, age 45, is a male, height is 176, he has a prostate cancer. These are information from the hospital. You have Anita Dimato, age 80, is a female, height is 120, has a breast cancer. You have James. So you can see this full information. But this is what we do when we are carrying out the identification. We remove their name, we put what we call pseudonyms. Pseudonyms are like serial number for identifying these people. So we put pseudonyms, and then you see their age, their this, their disease, blah blah blah. So then we can publish this kind of the identifier or pseudonymized database. We can publish this type. So nobody knows who owns this information. But the moment we introduce a re-identification file, they're like pseudonyms, then the names will be revealed. So this is what the attacker needs. They need the re-identification parameter. Once they match it with it, then the names of the people will be revealed. And then they will know which person has which disease. Okay? So this is pseudonymization. Okay? Now, let's move on. Still on this, we have the identifier data set containing one or more quasi identifier. A good example is the hospital record. This one, voter registration. Okay, this public data set with direct ID and same set of quasi identifier. It has a direct ID identification. Okay, this one is not de-identified. So the attackers will be able to match this with whatever you have here. Select record with unique QID values. Also select record with unique QID values. So at the end of the day, they will merge them. When they merge them, they merge the record with matching QID values, and then they will be able to find whose information. So the attacker will use a voting record in the United States, your data, to match your health status, and at the end of the day, they will be able to know which individual has which information. So you can see these are public data, okay, with their names and so on and so forth. This is the published one, the one you publish to the general public. See, the names are no more there. You give them a zip code or whatever. Oh, they have a zip code, but you take out their names. Okay, now the result of linked attack. When they attack this one, what they get in figure 7.7 is the leakage attack example. When they attack you, they'll be able to get the names of who this, you see? They'll be able to figure out these names, and it will be a full set of table. So it will be a full set of table. This is where your database, you have this table and this table, but the attacker will be able to find how, and then they will be able to create the database with all of the information in it. Privacy preserving data publishing. Okay, when you are publishing anything, you have to, this is a data without privacy, and this is one with privacy. you put confidential okay, you put identifier, blah blah blah, you put the code, and then you'll be able to protect your data. Before you publish any data, you have to take out their names and so on and so forth. You have to put identifier, quasi identifier, direct identifier, direct ID, see, there, quasi bracket, direct ID, direct identifier, quasi identifier, confidential attribute, non-confidential attribute, then you close. Then similarly, this one is for unprotected macro data file. Unprotected macro data file. But for a protected macro data file, it will be, you see, we now start with PM, then we say quasi bracket, QI, okay, quasi identifier, confidential attribute, non-confidential attribute, where QI is the set of QI transformed to privacy, preserve privacy. Okay, now let's go to disclosure risk versus data utility. You know, data has to be available, right? Because we need them for analysis, for research, and so on and so forth. And then, what level? There must be a trade-off between disclosure and data utility, right? So, in considering PPDP techniques, the organization needs to be mindful of the trade-off, you see, between disclosure risk and data utility. And the trade-off is between this concept, the maximizing data utility, how we maximize the use of data, okay? The identified data should be faithful to the original data in critical ways. The application of the analysis should be able to produce meaningful results despite the obfuscation of the QI. And then minimizing disclosure risk. We must be able to minimize how we disclose our data, because disclosure refers to the revelation of information that relates to the identity of the data subject. The data subject is the PII principle, okay, the PII, personally identifiable information principle. Now, disclosure risk relates to the probability of disclosure under the given sets of circumstances. Now, let's quickly look at it. The data utility. Now, data utility is subjective. Yeah, this is subjective. Why? Because what I'm for data for is different from what B might need the data for. So it's a subjective measure made by the management that depends on the nature of the application and the degree of accuracy and completeness of the requirement or of any required set of data. Now, the same data utility is the determination of disclosure risk is difficult, right? Because if you want to make data super available, then the disclosure rate is difficult and at best can be estimated, can only estimate. Okay? So the Federal Committee on Statistical Methods indicate that the disclosure risk of the individual being identified from a microdata file and a public data file depend on the following factor. One is the probability that the individual for whom an adversary is looking is represented on both the macro data file and some matchable file. The matchable file could include the voter registration details. And then the micro data file could be the identified data sets, like your hospital one, the one you published, and that is anonymized or that is identified. Then the probability that the matching variables are recorded identically on the microdata file and on the matchable file. So there's a probability, like it's an iteration. Okay, the probability that the individual for whom the adversary is looking is unique in the population for the matchable variables. So the individual probably unique. He's a popular figure, or so on and so forth. He has a job, he has a social security, everything is a unique individual. The degree of confidence of the adversary that he or she has correctly identified a unique data. So these are four probability that enhance this case. Now let's move on quickly. Now we say this is a plot between the disclosure risk and data utility. See, there must be acceptable risk level. You must take risk. which is a trade-off at the average value. But it will be a trade-off between the risk disclosure and data utility. Okay, let's move on quickly. So similarly, we've explained this type of things. Table 5 points is the identified data. You see, no names. These are examples of protected information. No names. We've taken out the 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 names. So these are examples of de-identified using quasi identifier. Okay. You remember direct identifier is your name and your address. Quasi identifier like your date of birth, your zip code, your social security number, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's it. Now let's move on. Say example of two anonymization. See, anonymization, the names of the owners. This person, we don't know the name. We know the age. We know he's a male. We know his zip code. We know he has arthritis. Okay, but the person's name is not here. His address is not here. So the same thing we've done here. Two anonymized version. We've anonymized this one. You can see this one. They will remove their zip code, their sex, and so on and so forth. To make the data a bit unintelligible, we obfuscate the data. Okay, so let's move on quickly. The same thing we've done here. Example of the attribute disclosure. Okay, we see we take out their names and so on and so forth. Now, summary data protection. Remember summary table. Summary table is a macro data table, right? You remember that? Remember that. So summary table are defined as containing aggregated data. They have row and column, right? They are macro. They have row and column in a database. So the summary table are defined as containing aggregated data about individual derived from the micro data. You know, you get the information from micro data source to make the macro. Okay, summary table may either be frequency count table or magnitude table. Okay, we already kind of explained all this before. A certain level of privacy protection is inherent in summary table because the data in the summary table aggregates and so does not contain the record that correspond to the individual, but rather provides data for reference to the number of individual. So this one does not provide the individual, but has information that can help locate the individual. Now, summary table attack. What kind of attack can happen to summary table? One is external attack. Two is internal attack. Three is dominance attack. Now, the external attack is coming from outside, usually like your ethnicity and your town, like your town, your ethnicity. Okay, we can use this to create an external attack. The internal attack is coming from respondent of ethnicity and town, the blood group, and so on and so forth. You'll be able to do internal attack. The dominance is another attack that happens to summary table in a database. If one or few respondent dominates in the contribution of a cell in the magnitude table, then the dominant respondent can have an upper bound the contribution of the rest of the information in the table. Okay, so this is a table showing an example of disclosure limitation for sensitive cells in a frequency table. Okay, the example of disclosure limitation. They didn't disclose everything. Let's say these are countries, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. We just assume they are countries, low, medium. So you don't know what this really is. They kind of make it not super clear for you. The privacy threat. We've treated privacy threat a lot, right? Let's move on. Let's just look at the figure. This one includes the disclosure limitation approaches for online query system. Now let's take a look at this. The first one here is query restriction. You know, databases, we have to always create a query restriction in order to create a logical control of our system. For example, you send a query, the control logic, we go to send a message to the query history and get a feedback, and then before he is able to access the microdata file. Okay, exact response or denial. Either you get an exact response or you get a denial, because if you are not supposed to, then you'll be denied. Now let's take a look at query perturbation approach. You set a query to control logic. Control logic just access the microdata and give you a perturbed response. Okay, this one you can see this is a perturbed response. So this one is not as protective as this one, as the restricted one. And let's move up with query restriction. You say query restriction is very important, right? Is the right way to go in a database. It's a very appropriate approach if the query application requires a deterministically correct answer. So query restriction is very necessary if you need a probability of correct answer, a very deterministic approach of a correct answer. And these numbers must be exact, must be very exact, okay? These numbers must be very exact, right? So let's talk about one of the reasons why we need the query restriction is to protect against disclosure when exact answers are provided. When exact answers are provided. Query restriction denies queries that risk disclosure. With query restriction, each query must pass through a series of filters. That's why it's very important. Must pass through series of filters that applies various disclosure limitation rules. The main challenges of query restriction are three major challenges. One is that the database can be repeatedly queried. It's like you are querying the whole database every time. Another one is a consequence of a preceding problem. The computational body of keeping track of previous query can be significant also. Then another one is the collision. Collisions attacks can circumvent the query limit. So these are the three challenges of query restriction, the three major challenges. Now let's take a look at the methods of query restrictions. There are 5 methods of query restrictions. Okay, 5 methods of query restrictions are the identified, and a database will typically implement more than one of these methods. Well, the first one is the query set size control. The second one, set size control. So it will reject any query that contain too few or too many records, because they've set the size control restriction on this query. So any request that is less or bigger, this will be rejected. Query set, the second one type of second method of query restriction is the query set overlap control. This one allows queries that have small overlap with previously answered queries. It allows them. The third one is oddity. Okay. Oddity involves keeping current logs of all queries made by each user and checking for possible compromise when a new query is issued. Then the fourth method is partitioning. Partitioning involves separating a data set into a disjoint subset of individual record. Partition, as you create another small one under the main one. Then the third method is cell suppression. Cell suppression is a very worthwhile technique in the static case of creating the identifier microdata file. It's very important. It presents difficulties for responding to online queries. So it makes it difficult for those who want to attack the system. Response perturbation. Response perturbation involves modifying the response values to user queries while leaving the data in the microdata file untouched. So you are just modifying the response values on the user query, but the microdata file is untouched. Common methods of response perturbation are random sampling query, rounding, and differential privacy. Okay, so this is the end of the summary of our work. We've looked at the difference between summary table and microdata file, an even queryable database. Then we looked at understand the concept of re-identification parameter. We've also looked at the types of identification attack. re-identification attack. We also looked at the difference between anonymization and de-identification. We've discussed the importance of quasi-identifier and how they pose a threat to privacy. We list and explain the basic techniques for privacy preserving data publishing. We also explain and illustrate the concept of the Q anonymity. And then we'll discuss the approaches of protecting frequency table. We discussed the approaches to protecting magnitude table. We understood the nature of privacy, and we also understood the nature of privacy, the threat to queryable databases. We discussed the approach to query, and we discussed the approaches to response perturbation, and understood the concept of differential privacy. So this is what we have for this class. Thank you for your attendance.